All right, so good morning. I hope everyone has had some coffee and is ready to go. So this is the last day of ConveyUX, right? So first 2 days, pretty good? All right. So there's really no better cure for a hangover on this last day than a talk about changing perceptions through user experience. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to talk about that. If you want to find me on Twitter, I'm at Adam D. Harrell. Make sure you put a D. If you don't put a D, the dude's a neo-Nazi. That is not me. So please, if you tweet it, tweet the D. I've complained to Twitter. They don't care. He's probably not even a real person. As John mentioned, about 14 years ago, I founded an agency called niba. We're a human-centered agency focused on designing and building complex digital experiences, brand storytelling, buyer journey marketing, all that fun stuff. We're headquartered in Atlanta, Georgia, have about 85 employees. And today I want to talk about a project that we did recently. In October of last year, we launched a redesign of the MARTA digital experience. And for those of you that aren't familiar with MARTA, MARTA stands for the Metro Atlanta Rapid Transit Authority. So Atlanta is known for a lot of things, right? It's known for hip hop, it's known for John Lewis and as the birthplace of Martin Luther King. It's known for traffic. It's not necessarily known for transit. If you watch the Super Bowl, you also know that we are known for blowing incredible leads in Super Bowls. But the transit system, MARTA, actually does a pretty amazing job. They move about 500,000 people a day throughout the region. They have 48 miles of rail, 550 buses, and their total economic impact is around $2.6 billion. And when they called us, the existing site had some challenges. People don't normally call us when things are good, right? No one hires an agency like ours because they want things to stay the same. And the truth was their existing site pretty much fed directly into your preconceptions of what a government-run website would look like. So this is what it started as. For some reason, they had banner advertising at the top, which sort of made it look like it wasn't the real site. I'm sure at some point, there was a design philosophy and design language behind it, but over time, it had just been tacked on. It had been duct taped. The site felt old and outdated. And as you dived in, it really didn't get a lot better. It was difficult to find things. So they knew that they had some challenges that needed to be solved. And it's also a pretty big organization. They employ a couple thousand folks. And what has happened over the time was since this site didn't work too well, a lot of the divisions had created their own sites. So all of a sudden you'd be going within the site, you'd click on something and you'd end up on a completely different site. No way to get back. So the police had created their own site. Transit-oriented developers had created their own site. So it ended up being a very sort of fractured experience. So when we're talking about taking on a project, one of the things we always talk about is like, will there be a before and after? So this was a pretty easy before and after, right? Like making this look better wouldn't be that hard. But that wasn't our goal. We wanted to look at it from a little bit of a bigger perception. And what we wanted to do was really change perceptions of MARTA and transit in Atlanta. They have new leadership, and they've been doing some really amazing things. Keith Parker, the CEO, has really transformed the organization over the last few years. And they're really one of the best-run transit agencies in the nation. And there was one other piece of context, and that was that in November of 2016, there was a multi-billion-dollar ballot measure vote coming up. So the city of Atlanta citizens were asked to institute a new sales tax that would give the transit agency $2.5 million. So a month after we were scheduled to launch, people are going to vote on this multi-billion-dollar sales tax piece. So we didn't want to botch that either. So for us, when we looked at it, we said the solution really lied in human-centered design. But it was also a thing where we had to look at it and say, how could we avoid the mistakes of the past? Because the truth is, the problem with the old site wasn't the people, right? No one likes to create things that don't look good or that are hard to use. The problem was the process. And if we wanted to elevate the experience, we had to really fix that process piece first. And there was a few key things that we communicated to them that we had to do if this was going to work. The first was put the focus on the users, not the internal stakeholders. Just because someone in the police department wants a new website doesn't mean that's the right experience for users. And we just had to keep coming back to that and use that as sort of a guidepost for the project. The next piece was we said, we don't want this to be designed by committee. Let's narrow it down, have a small group of decision makers, and if there's a question, let's test it with real users. Testing it with real users is going to be more effective than 1,000 arguments and internal reviews. And the third piece was that we didn't want to just focus on user experience from the standpoint of removing usability issues or solving hurdles. We wanted to actually elevate the overall experience from top to bottom. So it would only be as good as the content it contained. The site could look great, but if the content stayed the same, it wasn't going to accomplish the goals. So everyone in here is probably in the UX field or in the design field. So you know that empathy is often at the heart of creating remarkable experiences, right? Empathy and understanding is how you find insights, and those insights drive design. And as humans, we're really wired for this. We have mirror neurons that actually allow us to understand people's feelings, to understand their intentions. But in the design process, you have to account for that. And we did it through interviews. We started with interviews. Lots and lots of interviews. So we interviewed actual MARTA writers to learn what they needed from the site, and those interviews helped us guide the process. The first type of interviews we did was we put Ethnio screeners, just a JavaScript-based screener on the site. People filled it out, and we scheduled qualitative calls. And in those calls, we really wanted to understand 3 key things. What were their transit habits? What did they get out of the existing site experiences? What were those challenges? And then what was their brand perceptions, right? So how do you normally get around? How often do you ride MARTA? Asking them to walk us through their commute on a daily basis. Have you visited the website? If so, what challenges did you run into? How would you describe your perceptions of MARTA? How would you describe your perceptions of public transit? What type of person rides the train? What type of person rides the bus? So by understanding those perception pieces, that really allowed us to look at it and say, who are these audiences? We didn't want to just get people that were using the existing site. So we also sent human pop-up ads to the train stations. So people to just interrupt people as they got off the train, do a little screener and set up follow-up calls. So basically intercept folks at the station. And there was another audience that we were concerned about that we wanted to make sure had a voice, because oftentimes they're left out. And that was the disabled. So MARTA has an accessibility committee that's made up of advocates for the disabled and the blind and people with challenges. And we worked with them closely to make sure that they had a voice going into the project and that this project was something that solved their concerns. And then lastly, I talked about this earlier, but we knew if this project was going to be successful, we had to align all those different business units. Police, procurement, careers, diversity, transit-oriented development. All these different groups with their own sort of agendas. So we did a lot of stakeholder interviews, really designed just to get their input earlier, so they didn't give us feedback later that would derail the project. So what did we learn? And I want to focus on sort of the findings from the rider standpoint, the folks that ride transit. We segmented these folks into 3 key audiences that we felt had sort of unique end goals, audience goals, life goals, and experiences goals. The first was the only option rider. So these are folks whose only option is to take transit. They spend the most time commuting. They ride the train, they ride the bus. It's the only way they get around. They see MARTA and public transit in general as safe, but they're the ones that are most critical of a service issue, which makes sense. If a train breaks down, if a bus doesn't show up, they can lose their job. All right, so they have much higher standards on the service piece. And when you talk to them, they said things like this. It gets you from A to B. If you don't have a car, it gets you where you need to go. The next audience was pretty different. They're what we call choice riders. And for them, public transit was really a signifier of an urban lifestyle that they aspired to. Like, they were proud of the fact that they don't drive the car. Like, their ideal weekend would be a car that gets in a garage and never gets touched. They use the train and they integrate it into other modes. So, they're going to ride their bike to the station. They're going to get off the station, take their bike, and ride to where they're going. Or they're going to, ride the train, hop in an Uber, and then get where they're wanting to go. And they use it because of convenience. They hate traffic. They hate driving. They want to live that that sort of idealized urban lifestyle. And these folks actually pick where they want to live based on how close their house is to a MARTA station. The last audience segment was the occasional rider. So these are the folks that, they're not commuting via MARTA. They have an occasion of use. They're going to a concert. They're going to a game. They're going to a festival downtown. And what's interesting with MARTA versus some other transit agencies is the occasional riders really only interact with the train. So one of the things that was striking to me in Seattle is bus usage is much more common. But in Atlanta, the train is what the occasional rider would use. And they don't even consider the bus an option, which is really an opportunity. So quotes like this are what we heard from them. Once in a blue moon, we'll take it to a Braves game. Really, the only time is to the airport. These are the folks that when they fly out, they take it to the airport. So if we wanted to change perceptions, one of the things we had to do was change how we actually talked about transit. When we started, this was their positioning statement. So MARTA is an integral part of the community, the economy, and the transportation system in Metro Atlanta. It provides a meaningful mobility choice and attractive alternative to the automobile for all residents and visitors to the area. MARTA is a safe, secure, and reliable public transportation system with emphasis upon customer service and cost effectiveness. It was a mouthful, right? And no one really says meaningful mobility. So the VP of marketing was like, look, we have to solve this challenge. And we worked closely with her and the team to really revise this and figure out a way to make it more conversational, but also speak to the economic value. So we reframed a message to be simpler and more human-sounding. So MARTA provides cost-effective, reliable transit to Atlanta, spurring economic growth, enhancing the lives of all citizens, and leading the way to a less congested and more connected future. So reorienting that messaging to be something that really spoke to the future state, not just the now. We also wanted to take and develop sample key messaging that would really provide a blueprint for copying content and tone moving forward. So things like miles better. MARTA has 48 miles of rail stations across 38 stations. So messaging that counteracts that perception that it doesn't go anywhere. Or messages that spoke to safety, pointing out the fact they have 10,000 cameras and 300 police officers to keep it safe. Or that spoke to the convenience piece, that the commute could be less stressful. Let someone else drive, read, relax, and ride. Or more call to action oriented messaging that was just a little more clever and conversational. Get a new ride, fully electric, 1,000 horsepower and room for 150 friends. So that was sort of the messaging side of it, how we talked about it and the tone that we wanted to carry through. But content isn't just words. So we also wanted to revisit the photography assets that we were working with as well. So we developed brand new photography assets. We did a 3-day shoot across all 38 stations, as well as bus and mobility. And we identified 5 core types of photos that we felt were going to be needed in the experience. And I encourage anyone that's going through a process like this, think through what are those applications of photography, and then start creating categorized lists that you can then build your shoot list out of. So one type of photography we wanted to make sure to capture was the architectural places, the architectural photography, right? For showcasing stations. We're going to have station detail pages. We know we want to showcase these. We want to portray the brand in a positive manner. So let's get well-shot architectural photography. The next type was what we called motion photography. So showing the dynamic nature of transit, showing trains in motion, showing people in motion, less focused on the individual, but more on just that feeling of movement, people moving and moving through public spaces. And then we also wanted lifestyle photos. If we had just gone with architectural and those sort of more abstract movement photos, we'd lose a little bit of humanity, right? So it's always good to have some smiling faces. And then we talked about the multiple modes of transit. That was a key thing that we wanted to capture. We wanted it not just to be folks using the train, but also bringing their other forms of transit in. So, shots of people riding Ubers, shots of people putting their bike on the bus, shots of people putting their bike on the train. And then finally, we wanted to get some shots of employees, from the police officers to the bus drivers to the maintenance workers, things they could use in recruiting, et cetera, that really helped humanize the staff and who the employees were. So once we figured out, hey, let's revamp the content and messaging and photography aspect, we really moved into the bulk of the work, which was creating that human-centered digital experience. And I talked earlier about the challenges of the existing site, and part of it was, it didn't look good. The other part was the existing information architecture really lacked hierarchy. So if you look at their sitemap, yeah, not a lot of hierarchy there. In fact, when we mapped it out, there were 22 items that were used in top navigation at some point throughout the site. And if you clicked in certain areas, the top navigation would completely change. So it was a little confusing. So we really took all this complexity down and we said, let's simplify the approach and streamline the information architecture. We wanted to focus on that core audience of writers. So we bucketed it into 5 key areas: plan a trip, MARTA 101, fares and refills, service updates, and more about MARTA. All the 4 out of the 5 are writer-focused, right? Those are focused on the customer. The 5th is really the internal stuff. This is where careers, procurement, all that complexity that I talked about earlier would live under. But we knew that if we went back to, the other stakeholders within the organization, we just said, we're going to put you all in a bucket. They weren't going to love that. And so oftentimes with projects like this, sitemaps alone aren't enough to visualize the experience. So when you're presenting a sitemap or a navigation or an information architecture, actually prototype out what the navigation looks like. I find this is really helpful. So we did these really rough mock-up wireframes when we presented IA, showing how alerts would fit into the navigation, how we were thinking that navigation should not only include links, but also key information, so train hours, frequency, etc. And make sure that as you're presenting this stuff, they can visualize how all this stuff might actually work. Giving them a view through and taking something that can be really abstract, an outline or a flowchart, and making it a little bit more tangible to them. Walking them through how all this stuff would actually be organized under the more. So, doesn't matter. Does it really, Siri? Come on. So now moving into designing the new experience. That always happens to me when I'm in the car. And I have a 3-year-old daughter, so whenever I'm driving and all of a sudden Siri starts talking, she goes, "Play Frozen!" So no, I should have just said "Play Frozen" really loudly. So, moving into actually designing the experience. So once we had buy-off and sign-in into information architecture, we knew we wanted to create a seamless experience across device types. But we didn't want it to be a pure responsive play. We wanted it to be a little bit adaptive. We wanted to have those native gesture feelings across device types. And we also knew that with a project with this much complexity, it'd be really easy to just start creating 100 different templates for everything, right? So we wanted to focus more on designing flows and patterns that could be reused, not templates. And that way we could easily roll out new features, we could roll out new functionality, and development could take place in a much more agile manner. So this was where the design ended up, a whole new language. And a key part of this process was really creating that elegant and scalable design language, from grid structure to navigation schemes to iconography and form-based design elements, so that we could establish a unified and consistent look, right? But what we tried to do was nail down as much of that stuff as early in the process as possible. So we thought through grid and type and all those things before you'd even moved into detailed pattern design for subpage flows. And what that allowed us to do was we had a rough visual language that we could then use in prototyping. Because with a project with this much complexity, you don't want to spend 2 months creating Axure prototypes, right? And then they get thrown away. You spent all this time building interactive prototypes within a specific tool, and then they get thrown away. So what we wanted to do was create wireframes in responsive HTML. We used some of the initial design pattern stuff. We created fully responsive prototypes in HTML. And this had a few key advantages. One, testing with HTML is super easy, right? We can test it on screen readers. We can test it on everyone's own device. The other piece is if you go this route, what makes this worthwhile is making sure that what you build can actually be leveraged later on. So you're actually working your front-end development process into the prototype process. So if you have the capability and the resources to do so, this can work really well. And what it also allows you to do is go ahead and start working on the more challenging functionality pieces before detailed design's even done. So we went ahead and actually built out the plan-a-trip functionality in responsive HTML and had the backend team start working it in. And I was really glad we did this because what we learned was that our original plan, which would have been super simple to use Google Maps for transit directions, actually wouldn't work because Google Maps transit data isn't updated in real time. So if a schedule changes, all of a sudden they go and wait for a train and no train shows up. So we had to go into we had to use another technology. And almost all the decisions on site design and functionality were based on that research we did earlier. And you know, that's sort of the core idea behind human-centered design. So those personas that I outlined earlier, there were a number of key insights that directly led to functionality that we decided to use. So for instance, during our interviews, one of the things that came up a lot was the riders wanted easy access to real-time arrival and delay information. So we added this, and this actually dynamically updates. People could go in and filter. As of train boards, it shifts. So you could just have one page saved on your phone, pull it up, and see when the next train arrives at your station. The other piece was that we discovered there were really 3 types of delays and alerts. The first is, my bus is a couple minutes late, right? And we hid that in sort of these social style alerts on the left. Click on the bus alert, and it'll tell you, hey, bus is running late on this specific route. The other is that we've made a significant change to a schedule. We're repairing a rail line. We're down to 30 minutes on weekends instead of 15 minutes. That's sort of the big alert. Then the final's like, oh shit, it snowed, right? I think Seattle handles snow like Atlanta, which is it just shuts the entire city down. And that's a much bigger piece. So we really looked at it and said, how could we do contextual alerts, change the way they're displayed based on the severity? The other piece that I talked about was the multimodal trip planning. Now, as I said, we originally thought this would be really easy, but we ended up having to work with a mapping system that was built out of some grads at Georgia Tech. They were a startup, and they used real-time transit data instead of the archived schedules that Google used. And it made it a little bit more of a challenging experience, but it turned out really nice. And then the last insight was, how do we get this occasional rider to actually ride a little more? And part of it's giving reasons to ride, right? Atlanta has a huge, it's a big tourist town, and folks come in and they go to the aquarium and the Center for Civil and Human Rights and the Coke Museum and all that stuff. But a lot of times they're not people that are necessarily comfortable with transit. So how could we give them things that would give them an occasion of use and give folks that worked in hotels, et cetera, an easy way to give them an experience? So foodie crawls, bar crawls, history tours, developing all this content on the site so that you're sort of inspiring someone to ride, encouraging their use. And the last thing was that in the past, screen readers, people that were blind and used screen readers, actually had to use a separate text-based only site. It worked okay, but it was a little bit of a pain, and it didn't always have all the same information. It wasn't as rich of an experience, so they were sort of a second. They had sort of a less than ideal experience. I always say that every design decision is an assumption, and there's an old saying about assume. It makes an ass out of you and me. So it's a question of how do you test those assumptions, and we ended up doing that. And what we found was, first, the trip planner was pretty much unusable that we had originally built. So I talked about changing it from Google Maps to the other solution. One of the things that happened when we did that was the new solution provided 3 options. And the way it fed the data, you had to select an option before it returned results for that. but we were using design patterns we developed in the past. So it turned out that no one realized you actually had to select an option to view directions. So we went into testing like no one could successfully plan a trip. So we made it automatic. We made the select option happen, and it carried through pretty easily. The other piece was we weren't quite as accessible as we thought we were. The real-time arrivals piece, the way it was developed, the way the JavaScript code it used, what it actually did was dynamically reload it in, and screen readers weren't catching it. So if you were on a screen reader, if you were blind and you were trying to see when the next train was coming, you couldn't. So it's those detail things that really make the experience and uplift the experience. The last thing was, users really wanted info at parking stations, and we completely overlooked this. You know, we like to think of like transit and car as sort of these opposite ends of the things. And our assumption is that you would know if your local transit or local MARTA station had parking. But a lot of people, they just want to know if that station has parking so they can ride to the airport. The folk that rides, the person that rides to the airport every 18 months, they don't know if they've moved, you know. So we actually ended up having to adding parking details on all the station detail pages. So what were the results? Were we successful? We tracked events such as viewing alerts, trip planning, etc., and we saw some really huge upticks in engagement. So mobile engagement improved about 139%. So these are actions that MARTA wanted people to take. Mobile engagement actually improved 351%. Desktop engagement improved 139%. And 132,000 trips were planned. Just to put that in context, less than 1,300 were planned using the old trip planner because it was pretty challenging to do. But the bigger question, as I talked about earlier, was did we change perceptions? And I wanted to highlight a little bit of the social stuff that came across after the site launched. This first one was great because it speaks to utility, right? So this guy, Morgan, now using MARTA for a commute, the improved It's MARTA website is making a difference. So it makes you feel pretty good. This guy, you know, the new responsive It's MARTA so good, this is what design at MARTA should look like. Great work. Bravo on the new website. You know, website looks so much better, user-friendly, great job, etc. And this one's my favorite. MARTA redid their site, and at a glance, it looks ... good. Actually usable? Question mark. What alternate universe did I just step into? My God, I can find necessary information. I can't believe the best thing to come out of 2017 is the MARTA website. So I liked that one. I saved that one. And what about the ballot measure? I mentioned that in November there was a vote to raise $2.5 billion for MARTA expansion. Well, it passed. 68% of the vote. $2.5 billion is now allocated for MARTA's expansion, and this didn't happen because of the site. Yeah, 2016. Yeah, so last November. So that was the good news in November after the election. There was other news that I didn't think was so good. And really, the MARTA team deserves all the credit for this. Our job was just to avoid a healthcare.gov like style botched rollout. We just couldn't completely blow it up. But they did a great job on messaging this, and really voters responded, and they passed this. They volunteered to tax themselves to expand the system. So I think I have just a couple more minutes, and we'll do Q&A. So I wanted to give just a little bit of bonus advice. This is your free bonus at the end of a talk. And the first thing is that one of my favorite definitions of what design is comes from a Nobel Prize winning economist. And I teach design to some students, and I always say if design doesn't solve a problem, it's not design. It's art. It's self-expression, right? But this guy, Herbert A. Simon, he won a Nobel Prize as an economist. He wrote a book called The Sciences of the Artificial. And he defined a designer as everyone design who devises courses of actions aimed at changing existing situations into preferred ones. And I think that's a great one because it speaks to the intentionality of trying to change one behavior to another. And this is what Herbert looked like. Doesn't look like a designer, right? But he invented design thinking. Like in his book in 1969, The Sciences of the Artificial, he actually made the argument that design is a practice, that it's a method of things. And he he's the one that really should be credited with this sort of shift in design as an aesthetic exercise to design as a problem-solving exercise. And, I think a lot of times you hear people say that great design's simple, right? You look at the old Braun radios, you look at anything, and it looks simple. But when they say that, what they really mean is it feels simple. Great design just moves all the complexity behind the scenes. This is one of my favorite examples. So years ago, I would have to book a car to the airport. This is what it looked like. All right, you'd fill out all that information. If you've traveled to a foreign country without Uber and had to do this recently, it's not fun. But Uber switched that to 2 clicks, right? And really, the reason they did that wasn't because it's simpler. They just moved all the complexity behind the scenes. The decision on where you're at, how you pay, all that stuff's already stored in your device, and they're pulling from it. So it took more work to make things look simple on the front end, but the complexity all happens underneath the water. The next piece of advice is always design and build the hardest thing first. There's a temptation to start with like the homepage or the dashboard if you're doing an app redesign, right? But honestly, those are relatively easy. So what if you flip it? What if you tried to design and build the hardest part of the project first? Because when things go wrong, when you can't get the data you thought you could, when the API doesn't work as expected, when something doesn't work as you think, you'll have more time to course correct. If you thought you could do something and you can't, you can change plans and you have time to do so. But if you start with the easy part, and that takes a little longer than you thought, all of a sudden the hard part gets compressed. And that's really where you need all the time. And lastly, loving what you do is better than doing what you love. Pursuing your passion is bullshit. I love wine. I would open a vineyard and then I would start picking grapes and realize there's spiders in grapes and not love it so much. So instead of pursuing your passion, be passionate about what you're pursuing. The amount of effort you put into something, the more pride you'll get out of it. And actually, there's one more bonus piece of advice. Be optimistic when things are bad and be pessimistic when things are good. I always tell people that great employees and great leaders are shock absorbers. When everyone else is down, when the odds are stacked against them, they're the ones that are optimistic. They stay strong. And then when things are going well, they're the ones that guard against complacency. They're the ones that, they don't strain their shoulder patting themselves on the back. They're the ones that actually stand up and say, hey, we need to watch out. Someone's coming on our heels. So thank you. How much time do we have left? All right, so a little time for Q&A. This is the book he mentioned. If you enjoyed my talk, please check it out, Creative Direction in the Digital World. You can go to digitalcreativedirection.com. You can order it on amazon.com. And I'm happy to take any questions. Right behind you was first. She was quick.
I really like how you brought everything together from visual design, photography, UI, UX. And I'm just curious, what does that team look like?
So in this project, the team had a project manager, a creative director, a visual designer, a front-end developer, a UX person, and a researcher. A UX researcher. The MARTA team actually did the CMS build and implementation. We handed all the front-end code and the trip planner build over to their team for implementation into the CMS. Yeah.
You preface this by saying I lived in Atlanta for about 10 years.
Yeah.
But it was 15 years ago.
Okay.
My first question was, were there any major MARTA initiatives, say between 2001 and now, other than this bond thing, where MARTA had major improvements or initiatives in PR?
So one of the big things was they did get a new CEO who's done a remarkable job. The other piece is the city, like most cities in the United States, has really grown pretty remarkably. Atlanta is sort of considered two areas: ITP, inside the perimeter, and outside the perimeter. So ITP's had a lot of growth. Number of residents that live inside the city has grown tremendously. There's also been a major smart transit project called the Beltline, which is essentially we're taking all the old rail lines that used to surround Atlanta and we're turning them into a 22.6 mile ring of parks and transit and walkable infrastructure. So that really had that really played into it, in that it was no longer viewed as MARTA as just this one thing and that's all it'll ever be. It was viewed as we have this opportunity to transform and become the city we want it to be, and people really got behind it.
And that probably then answered a little bit of my second question. Did you, when you were first doing your user research, did you consider or look at the differences between riders and site users?
Yeah, we did. So that was one of the reasons. Yeah, and that was one of the reasons we did the intercepts at the stations to pull people. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think we actually interviewed people from 22 different geographic areas. So. I know when I lived here, perceptions of MARTA were mixed. Mm-hmm. You mentioned safety. Well, prior to the Olympics, they put so much effort into the Olympics. Uh-huh. So there's actually, we actually had a fourth segment I didn't talk about, which was Nonriders, and people that thought MARTA was like this hellhole of like den of inequity and that led people to the city. I'm just being extreme. Yeah. No, people that just weren't willing to take it. They didn't see any value in it. But we knew the digital experience wasn't built for them. What we really wanted to do was find the tribes who were willing to who wanted MARTA and supported MARTA and build the experience really to meet their needs. The non-riders we did speak to in messaging and things like that through talking about economic impact. Like at the end of the day, if you live north of the city and you never ride MARTA, but the fact that MARTA is the reason that NCR's corporate headquarters relocated, or Porsche's North American headquarters relocated, or Mercedes-Benz North American headquarters relocated, and they say because we wanted to be close to a rail transit, like that's a win. So that's how we address that audience. But we didn't really design the digital experience to speak to the folks that didn't ride or that had really negative perceptions.
Well, I was thinking too, I was really considering the difference between a large population and use MARTA, particularly like you were saying, the ones that have to use it, and how much of a divide or size difference was there in that population versus squeeze the site?
Yeah. So the people that are only option riders use the site because they have to. They want to know like when their stuff's coming up. They want to know when the bus is, the train's on time, all those type things. And a lot of times they're using them on mobile devices.
I guess you found pretty equal distribution of those folks having and using smartphones and that kind of thing?
Yeah. And smartphone usage had grown tremendously, basically like every other industry. Yes.
Hey, I'm super curious. I also live in Atlanta. Yeah. I'm an LA native, but I live there now. And you were talking about the integration with companies. Mm-hmm. So my company is actually integrated with MARTA to where there is now a bridge being built that comes directly into the new growth of the company directly into the building. So the question I wanted to ask was about stakeholders.
Yeah. You
mentioned that you had all these silos, everybody's kind of off doing their own thing. I'm super curious, how did you work with your stakeholders, or speak to that?
So really it was the team that worked at MARTA deserves a ton of credit for this. So when they came in, they established it and said, we're going to put the user first. And that's really what they did. They level set. But we met with all these folks individually. So we met with the assistant police chief, and we talked about, if we integrate these sites, you're going to get better candidates. There's no reason for you to try and manage your own site. Like, they weren't happy with those solutions either at the end of the day. So it's really about how can you flip it and turn it into a positive benefit for them. They'll get more visibility. If you're off the main navigation, more people are going to find your stuff. So that was really the piece. And then doing individual, meetings with all these groups. And for some groups, we did group meetings. We'd meet with careers, and we'd get the folks that managed all the careers website and get all those in the room. So we understood what their difficulties were. So when we came back to them, we said, hey, look, we're doing this, and we're also solving these problems that you had where something didn't currently work. Exactly. Yeah. And I think that's true with any complex organization with multiple stakeholders.
I had a question. So related to that question, one of the points that you had is you prioritize things that were obviously very hard to do, patterns or design wise.
Yeah.
So with these stakeholders, how did you figure out what to do first? How did you tackle that?
We looked at it from what was the sort of the most complex from like a project perspective. What's the biggest risk? So that was how we looked at it, and we said, what's the biggest risk? If we've sold trip planning is going to be way improved and it's not, like that's a big risk. Yeah, the first one we built, the data we didn't realize wasn't real time, so it would not give real information. So we had to find an alternative solution. The alternative solution actually ended up being cheaper as well, which is always a good thing.
I have a good question for you. How much of what you did changed what that budget that was done to improve MARTA overall? Mm-hmm. So from the digital experience to the customer experience. So were you able to influence things that would change, that would be part of that next feature of MARTA?
No, I mean the voter measure was really designed to, basically what it was allocate a percentage of a half-penny sales tax within the city of Atlanta to MARTA to fund expansion. And that was really aimed at infill stations. So, building more of those stations, connecting areas that weren't currently connected, adding more bus routes, et cetera. So that was really focused on service. It wasn't, we didn't go in and say, hey, there's a percentage of digital that should be allocated on that, because it was really focused on actual transit service and operations.
By that is the observations, the interviews, all the things that you did lead you to more than just digital issues.
Yeah.
So those things that were beyond that, did they flow up?
I mean, I think they were, any good organization is always receptive to customer feedback. So they looked at things like, hey, how can we increase bus frequency? Let's make sure that we don't forget bus, because it's really easy when you have a transit system to focus on the rail. But they realize that buses are also a lifeblood. So how can they address some of that feedback? And then looking at the specific issues around the site, when there's feedback or operational things, how can they make it easier to give a compliment to a good MARTA employee or a complaint? What are those sorts of things? But we sort of bucketed the feedback into what we could solve from a digital standpoint and other things they should look at. So, yeah. Oh, all right. Well, thank you all. I will be here all day if you have any additional questions. I appreciate you coming out early in the morning, even if you went out drinking last night. I know a few of you did. So thank you.